Nice.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion today about the healthcare data breach trends in 2023. For those of you who've been to our panels before about the data breach report, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, we do these twice a year, and once in the summer and then once at the beginning of the year, looking at the last year. And we have a lot to get through today. And so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. A couple of things to know. The chat is over on the right. Jump in, say hi, let us know where you're joining from. There's a little bell at the top with a little, if it doesn't have a line through it, you can click that. If it's going to ding too much, you can turn the mute on the chat. And everybody coming will get a recording of this. So if you registered or if you're here, the system will send you a recording. Who are we? So Critical Insight defends critical services against cyber attacks. And if you are in healthcare, that includes you. We consider you critical, and I know you consider yourselves critical. We do that by helping organizations prepare for a cyber attack, detect one quickly, and then respond decisively. So today, my name is Jake Milstein. I am CMO, which I sometimes change for the healthcare ones because I am not actually a doctor. I am not a chief medical officer. I don't even play one on TV, and I don't look like George Clooney. And I host our events. New to our webinars is Brett Shorts. He is a director of data analysis, and he put together the data for today's report. He is also an Excel whiz, and he hates that I put Excel whiz on there, but that's how it goes sometimes. And so Brett's going to be presenting data, and then the panelists today are Mike Hamilton, Fred Langston, who are co-founders of Critical Insight. Mike is currently our CISO. Fred's our Chief Product Officer. And we have a special guest joining us today, John Delano, who is VP at Christus Health in Texas, and former CIO of Integris and former CISO before that. So what we're going to talk about is, before we get to the report, we have a few things that are happening now that you all need to know about. And so we're going to go through those, heads up about those. Then Brett's going to go through the data from the breach report. And I put Q&A at the bottom. But the truth is, as we go ahead and put things in the chat. I love interrupting these folks. I'm going to ask them questions as we go as well. And so Q&A throughout, just put whatever comes into your mind in the chat, and I'll go ahead and ask them. So there are two big things, two urgent threats that have come across from the American Hospital Association in just the last couple of weeks. One of them is about O365. Fred, can you just tell people what the deal is with O365?
Sure. In June, the Federal Civilian Executive Branch, which is basically the executive branch of the government, realized that there was some suspicious activity in their Microsoft 365 cloud environment. And after digging in, they found some new types of attacks being used there. A lot of them rely on kind of reusing particular keys and tokens and credentials. So it's a relatively new, we don't know too much about it, but they came out with some very strongly worded guidance that came out. In particular, it talked about logging. And the first thing they say, and this is the first time I've ever seen this in a government publication, they say you need to have either E5 or G5 level logging. You need to turn on Purview audit logging, which is a premium logging feature for Microsoft 365. But we all know that Microsoft's in a lot of trouble because they're not exposing enough of their log data unless you pay for it. Here's the government coming out and saying, you will not be able to see this, period, if you're not at G5 level. So that's new. That's significant change. And then it talks a lot about how you're managing your logs, how you're making sure your baseline configurations are at least based on some standard, and that make sure that you're doing things with those logs as you collect them. So that's pretty much what it's about. We don't know too much now, but the big shift here is the government coming out and saying, if you don't have E5, G5, Can't see it. So this is kind of scary.
And then the other big alert from the American Hospital Association is about the receipt of ransomware. Now, this is a ransomware group that hit the Chilean army earlier this summer. And after it hit the country of Chile, now it appears to have turned its eyes onto healthcare, because one of the things we're seeing is an attack on Prospect Medical Holdings. The attack was 3 weeks ago, so it's not in this breach report, because the breach report we're going to talk about today is, from January to June, end of June. It's the first 6 months of the year, but this is happening, and it's important for folks to know about. Prospect Medical Holdings hit 3 weeks ago. Yesterday, they said, we do not have a definitive timeline for how long it will be before all of our systems are restored. They have 16 hospitals in California, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Texas. And one hospital, Waterbury in Connecticut, just told a reporter that they're still using pen and paper, and it's not clear how much longer they'll be on that. So that, even though it's not in this report, that highlights what's going on. And we're going to talk about that, right? That this larger group, they're not an independent group. They own 16 hospitals, that they got hit, and that actually fits some of the trends that we're going to talk about today.
Completely consistent. Yep.
Yeah, consistent. Mike, before we get into the report, you wanted to tell people about these 5 things.
I do. I want to talk about this. So, to the extent that you are here representing the healthcare sector, we're going to talk about the gloom and doom and the data breaches and the lawsuits and all of the bad stuff. This is not going unnoticed by all of the agencies that are there to provide guidance and tools and et cetera for you. So we would be remiss if we didn't point out that the Cybersecurity Framework Implementation Guide and the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices both just came out with new versions for this year, and they are very good. We're going to talk about them on a panel with the American Hospital Association coming up here in a couple of days. I would grab these. You can Google these names and find them fairly easily. They call it the hiccup. The hiccup has the 10 key practices, which interestingly calls out governance as a key practice that they want to see implemented. And this guidance is consistent with what we hear from the SEC, NCUA, Department of Financial Services in New York. Everybody's starting to talk about governance, and it's less and less about go out and buy a bunch of technology to help you solve this problem, and you better be managing this right. So here's a few pieces of guidance that have all come out recently. NIST 866R2. I'm not sure that the official version is out that leans into incident response and risk assessment, but they have said this is where this is going. I think it's still a public comment period, as is with this DigiHeals initiative, which is brand new, and they are accepting submissions, ideas on new tools that could help cybersecurity in the healthcare sector up until September 7th. So either that's a free-for-all for vendors to get their tool on the list, or a lot of thoughtful people that have some good ideas. Either way, if you have a chance to participate, it's a good idea.
And the other thing, of course, HHS focusing on NIST CSF 2.0. And if you haven't seen this, govern now in the middle. When we get towards the end of today, Mike actually has a spreadsheet and handout he's going to talk about that relates to NIST CSF. Okay, so the report. So what we do is we look at the HHS Breach Portal, which I know some of you call the Wall of Shame. And what the way it works is, if there is a breach of a certain size affecting, you can see there, 500 or more individuals, it has to be reported to the federal government. These are self-reports, they're not audited, and so we'll get into what that means a little bit here in a little bit. But that that's the data that Brett uses to put together the numbers. When we look at what we've done, we've been doing this now for 4 years. We release this twice a year. We've seen lots of ups and lots of downs, and we've made some predictions. I like to go back and look and see what predictions we've made. Prediction number 1, we said that there would be more third-party breaches. I think you'll see that that's true. We said that EHRs would get breached. Now, I want to say we haven't seen a large-scale Cerner, Epic, that kind of breach. But last time we did this, we did see a breach of an EHR for an eye care center. And importantly, we have always said, don't trust the terrorists. After the first one of these we did, all of a sudden, the ransomware terrorists said, we're not going to attack healthcare. Healthcare is too important and we understand. And, and people said, oh, okay, they're not going to. I don't know who those people were, but we said, don't trust the terrorists. And it turns out you should not, in fact, trust the terrorists. All right, Brett, why don't you take us through the first numbers and what they mean?
All right. Thanks, Jake. So on this first chart, we're looking at the number of breaches by half-year period. We look at it at this data twice a year. So you can see we had almost 400 breaches in H1 of 2021, down a little bit, kind of similar numbers in 2022. And what we've seen through the first half of 2023 looks to be like a decline in the number of breaches. Certainly the trend is that way for the first half, but do want to point out that late in that first half, late June, Move It hit the news. And so those breaches are not going to be in those numbers for H1. So we are expecting that, that will hit H2 in that report. Still hoping for a lower total number in 2023 than we've seen in previous years.
And but you are seeing more records, Brett.
That's right. And so this chart is just focused on the hacking IT incidences, which of the 300 or so breaches we had in the first half, 73% of those were from hacking IT incidences. The columns here show the number of breaches per period, and then the lines there show the number of records. So H1 2021, you can see we had about 30 million records affected by hacking incidences. H2 of the same year, it dropped down to about 26 million, 2022, 23 million in each half. And then first half of this year really shot up to about 36 million records affected in the first half of the year. So definitely seeing, a big change there. Fewer breaches, but they're getting a lot more records in each of those incidences.
And and Fred, when you look at this is something actually I look back. You said it, a couple of years ago that the bad guys would start going after targets that gave them more records.
Yeah, I mean, just you want to go for the biggest bank vault you can. They're able now to identify who has a lot of records, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're the largest provider. It means that they have the access to the largest amount of records by whatever attack vector they're taking. So doesn't mean you're the largest. It means they have access to more of your records holistically than maybe they had in the past. Meaning maybe they get something that has all your patients rather than one clinical department that has a subset of those patients.
And John, I mean, I guess I would have the assumption that if you were an organization that had access to more records, that you would be an organization that had better security. Does that just not matter here?
Well, it would seem to go hand in hand, right? The larger you are, potentially the more money you have to spend on security. But certainly, we're all dealing with running the same systems with the same vulnerabilities. So in my opinion, it doesn't matter how big you are. We all deal with the same attack methods and the same risks that everyone else has.
Yeah, and Mike, I know you see this not just in healthcare, but across different industries as well.
Sure. The value of records, it's a little absurd to tell you the truth. We know how many people live in the United States. We know how many records have been stolen. The number of records far exceeds the number of residents. What's left to steal? But yeah, overall, the incident rate has gone down, but the amount of theft, if it's records, if it's money, if it's extortion, all that is going up. Isn't it true that what's the new bill for an average data breach is like $11 million in the health sector right now.
Yeah,
Isn't
it's
that
11
right?
million. Yep.
Right. And that is shot way up. So yes, all true.
Yeah, I want to point out too that I think the third party increase that we're going to talk about here is directly related to being able to get more of those records at a single attack. I think that has something to do with it.
It's the criminal corporations scaling.
And so, Brett, these are the three largest breaches in terms of number of records, right?
That's right. And this, really represents that trend that we were seeing on the previous slide, where the breaches are down, but the number of records is up because we're seeing such huge breaches occur. And these are the top three that hit in the first half, but there were 5 other breaches that occurred that affected more than 2.5 million individuals. So, there is, again, really large breaches occurring in healthcare right now.
And, and John, even if as I look at who's in the audience, I see a lot of folks from hospitals. If you're a hospital, but, your patient's records get stolen from an insurer or a services firm, your customers, your clients, still blame you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had that personally happen on too many occasions, right? I mean, our patients don't understand the relationships that we have sharing data with insurers and other third parties. And so, I think it's always beneficial for the provider to at least send out some notification on behalf of the patient to let them know, even if it is a third party, right? They still don't know who that third party is because they don't have that relationship with them. They have the relationship with you.
Sure. And you're obviously you're the one in the community. You're the building they see, right? So, yeah, I mean, you can see that. And then Brett, here, we talked about the number of attacks being down. That's true. That's true across healthcare segments here.
Right. So, with the data, organizations are required to report, are they a provider, a business associate, a health plan, or a clearinghouse? We take those providers and break them down to see a little bit more detail and look for trends within the segments of provider. And you can see here, the top bar in each segment is the last 6 months of H2, and then the bottom bar is this past 6 months, the first 6 months of 2023. And really, in every segment, we see fewer breaches than we did in the last half of last year. Um, Hospital systems, 49 breaches in the second half of 2022, down to 37 in the first half of 2023. Specialty clinics saw a big drop from 59 to 26. So, yeah, again, within providers, fewer breaches are occurring.
And, I know, Fred, last time we talked about the specialty clinics, being way up. Should people read into anything? Read into the fact that specialty clinics are down from quarter to quarter, or, they're still being attacked?
I would say anyone who is not a hospital system is probably has less budget to spend on security and less people to devote to it. So I think what this is telling us is they're realizing that hospital systems are maybe, they're a good attack target, but so is all the other providers there. I think the interesting thing here was actually holdover from the last slide that Insure, for the first time ever, not ever, but the first time in a very long time, and Insure is now the biggest breach of the year. Because if you look at our previous healthcare breach response presentations, Insure is held really steady at the lowest percent.
And Fred has been
Oop, I
Comcasted.
think we lost Fred there, but yeah, I mean, what Fred was saying is right, that we haven't seen a lot of insurance breaches. And by the way, I talk to a lot of insurance companies, and they, in general, feel like the insurance companies I talk to a lot of cyber insurance companies, and they feel like the healthcare insurance companies are the medical insurance companies, are pretty stable and pretty well protected. And here we're saying that that's not necessarily true. I'll also point out that here in physician group, physician group may have gone down in numbers, but as we see here, the number of records from a physician group obviously went way up. Brett, can you now, jumping to this slide, can you explain this one to us?
Sure. The numbers here are really representing the provider segment only and the hacking incidences. Um, so the left column is the last 6 months of 2022. And then in the middle, what you can see there is the number of individuals affected by those breaches. So the 195 breaches that occurred in the last half of last year, almost 7.5 million individuals were affected by network breaches, 1.1 million by email, 7 million from EHR, and then another 100,000 from other. And then the column on the right is the first half of this year, and we had 140 breaches within providers that were classified as hacking incidences. And again, we've talked about this, but you could see the number of individuals affected from network breaches, 16.3 million, compared to the other categories. Email dropped from 1.1 to 0.3. So it's not necessarily that the email compromises aren't happening. It's just that the fewer records are coming through those hacks versus the network breaches. That's where they're getting all the records from.
And so let's talk about that a little bit. So,
Yeah.
and if
This
you
this
look,
to me
and
is
if,
the most interesting piece
yeah,
of the analysis right here.
yeah, I mean, I will give it one caveat, which is remember that these are not audited answers, right? And so what we see here is that, this is how hospitals, how healthcare organizations are reporting the breaches. So they're saying they're not coming from email as much anymore. They're coming from, their network breaches. So I do want to give that caveat, but Mike, why do you think this is the most interesting part?
Well, because this is the takeaway that you can get that will actually be actionable in your own organization. If the tactic has, so first of all, the strategy of the bad guys has shifted to go to the one-stop shop, hospital chain where they're providing records for a number of their affiliates, or the clinics that are supplying records for a number of, optometry, dental, whatever. So that strategy has changed, but tactically now it becomes a race. Every time a vulnerability is announced and you have that application or a piece of software that faces the internet, it is now a race between you and the actors. You got to get it patched before they find you, because they are immediately going to work doing reverse engineering of the patch so they can figure out how to build the exploit. Simultaneously they're scanning the internet. You just go to Shodan and you can easily find exposed applications that are vulnerable, and they go to work on that right away. That's what the whole Move It thing was about, and that wasn't the first one. So again, a lot of the Move It stuff is not included in here, and when we do this at the end of the year, this is going to spike way up. But clearly, and Fred wrote a paper about this. When an internet-facing vulnerability is announced, you need to drop what you're doing, IT staff, because this is an incident and it's now a race.
And hey, and John, does this ring true to you that that fewer breaches are coming through email? I mean, does it have to do with people having better email security, or it's just easier to attack a network vulnerability?
Yeah, I think the vector is certainly it's nice to see email kind of shrinking. I think part of that is we've done a good job through phishing campaigns and other education to train people not to click on links and emails or open attachments. And so I think that has partially played a part in that because we've done a good job of education. Now, as Mike mentioned and Fred and others, the attacks are getting more sophisticated. They're getting harder to recognize, but I think that the premise is still there where, we've trained people for many years now not to click on things they weren't expecting or open things that they didn't request. And so I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and Fred, as Mike mentioned, the paper that you wrote about, the fact that patches need to be happening urgently, now this seems to put a big red siren on that one. So if anybody's going to take something out of this, what do they take from it?
They take what Mike said. If there is a critical or high severity vulnerability on a system that is exposed to the internet or kind of a large untrusted population of users, you are in a race. You should probably call that an incident because it will happen if you do not patch it as rapidly as possible. So treat it like an incident, patch as fast as possible. You're in a race with the bad guys.
And I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat that dark reading article that Fred wrote in case people are interested in it.
Good idea.
And all right, Brett, can you explain this one?
Yeah, this one's maybe a little bit hard to digest at first glance, but it does a good job of representing the first half of 2023. The left side of the graph shows the breaches that came in and the allocation. So 65% of the breaches that we saw were at the healthcare provider, 21% were at business associates, and 14% with health plans. And then on the right side, again, it's representing where the individual records were affected. So, 65% of the breaches were at providers, but only 43% of the records, 17.3 million. And then business associates, you can see, the slope of that line increasing significantly, 21% of the breaches, but almost half of the records were at business associates. And then health plans just kind of round out the bottom with pretty consistent numbers.
And John, when you look at this and you think about the business associates, I mean, you got to update your business associate agreements. You got to know what's in them. That's knowing that they are the number one attack vector for number of records. What else do you do?
Yeah, and this one, Jake, is to me it's a constant challenge, right? You have to formalize a third-party risk assessment to be able to try to stay on top of this, and that in itself is a challenge. In the larger your organization is, the more third parties you have, and so it becomes a challenge there. The technology is constantly changing, so you're having to revisit, and so getting a process in place by every time you touch that vendor to be able to make sure that you have an updated business associate agreement, periodically doing an assessment. Has anything changed? Those are all challenging things to do. So it's not surprising to me to see that number on the rise and as big as it is, just because of the scope of trying to keep up with your third parties.
And, Fred, you had earlier talked about health plans, here, that's flat and business associates is up. Do you expect health plans to get bigger, or do you expect business associates to get bigger? Where do you see this going?
Well, health plans have stayed steady for a decade, frankly, because they actually, in the 2000 decade is when they got secure. And there aren't nearly as many, of course, health plans. But what you notice there is that was a dental insurer. So they probably have less resources, less manpower. It's not a Blue Cross. It's not, Premera or something like that. So less resources. You can still be a health plan, provider and be hit just like any other smaller medical.
And isn't it true too that last year when we did our the previous report, PFS was the financial, it was the payer that was hit really hard, and that was the source
He's
of a lot of
a
records.
debt collector, right?
Debt collector,
From
right?
memory?
That's
Yeah.
right,
Mhm,
right.
Medical
And
debt
so that
collector.
that confluence of medical records and fintech seems to be very attractive to the bad guys. And so that's one thing I'm watching is not necessarily debt collectors, but it's this combination of we have medical records in order for us to do our business, which is not strictly part of the healthcare sector, but is adjacent. And it's
Yeah, and Fred,
Ironic.
so
makes
yeah,
it a
sorry, Fred.
business associate, I guess. But
Yeah, I was
And
going to say, ironically, the U.S. government has stepped in because those entities are covered under Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA. They've had 2 updates to that standard after sitting dormant for almost a decade, and now they're starting enforcement around that because they see it as adjacent effects here, in this case, in healthcare.
and Graham Leach Bliley is essentially it's a privacy statute, isn't it?
Well, it's about anybody that gives credit to somebody has to adhere to it. So it could be payment, debt collectors, people that issue credit, loans, student loan, anything like that.
Fred, you and I were in Idaho talking to a group of hospitals there. And when we were, I remember you telling folks that they needed to go back and look at all of their business associate agreements because the number of attacks in business shop. Do you think that there should be now special focus on business associates that are holding financial data as opposed to others? Like if you're going to focus one area, that's what you should focus on?
Well, you need to focus holistically on all your business associates or any. So even, hospitals have people that sign agreements that aren't business associates, yet still have critical data, right? It's things that are related to, keeping the company and the hospital operational. So you have to look holistically across every type of third party you have, and even a third party that is not part of the healthcare, provision of healthcare can be an entryway into your network. It's the old fish tank at the hotel that was used to hack the hotel by getting into the fish tank that had remote access to it. So I've been to hospitals with fish tanks. So there you go.
That was actually a casino. They did that too.
A casino. It was a casino.
Was kind of a, I don't know, when's the movie going to come out?
I think it already did. I think that was like Ocean's 21 or something. Okay, so one of the other things that we're seeing as a change here is that the hacking and extortion strategies are changing. So double extortion versus single extortion. So and by the way, we've also seen the triple extortion. But the three places, Mike, if I have this right, are number one. I'm going to lock up your hospital. After I lock up your hospital and you pay me a ransom of $10 million. Oh, do you want your records back? That's another $10 million. And then we started to see the bad guys actually contact individuals whose records were stolen or re-ransomware them if they didn't get the bad guys out.
Yeah.
Those are all things that have happened in the past.
They do, and they don't necessarily happen in succession like that. They happen simultaneously. So the tactic today, and you left one thing out that I'll hit. The tactic today is when they get the initial access into a network and it's interactive access, they can come and go, they can look around. First thing they do is they jack a bunch of records. And later you're going to find out because you have the forensic data there to know exactly what they did take. After that's done, then they lay in the ransomware and they snarl the network, and that's when they start to contact you via, out of band communications or stuff will roll off the printers and things like that with the extortion demands. And it's if you are reluctant to pay them to get your network back because you have good backups and because your insurance company says don't do it, then they say, we will make all your records public and we know what happens after that. And and this is a little bit in the United States, a bit of a self-inflicted wound. The privacy statutes have all created this, right of private action so that if your records are stolen, and it doesn't matter if it's from the healthcare sector or not, if your records are stolen, a class can form to to litigate this, to sue you. And that's the terrifying part, because that is a much, much bigger number if you get a class action suit than if you just pay off that extortion demand. So this is a bit of a well thought through strategy. I hate to say that, but it's a bit of a well thought through strategy by these criminal corporations. The one that you left out is denial of service. They'll do a distributed denial of service attack, and if you want this to stop, you'll pay us. Right? That's another form of extortion. But the combination of records theft, records held in abeyance, if you will not pay to get your network back, is becoming all too common. There are some delineations there, because there's still some of these ransomware gangs that don't want to snarl a hospital, and they will just grab the records. So there's a few variants of this, but double extortion is usually ransomware plus records.
And so we're seeing actually more and more the non-double extortion, the single extortion, where they're not snarling, to use your word, the hospital network. Fred, why is that? Why wouldn't they want to lock up the hospital network?
I don't have a great answer for that, Jake. It just seems to be a shift in tactics. There's probably some economic driver behind it. So let's think of it this way. The first stage, as Mike mentioned, is gaining access. Second stage is exfiltrate data, right? So maybe it's just a faster path to getting paid, right? I don't have to wait a week or two and try to lay all the back doors and everything for a ransomware attack. I already got the data. Let's just go for the money right now.
Right.
Yeah.
And nobody dies that way, and nobody ends up, being labeled a terrorist and, potentially getting thrown in Gitmo, and they still get paid. Because, and again, we've done this to ourselves, these privacy statutes and the new generation of ambulance chasing attorneys that come in with a class action suit, that is a huge financial hit. And to avoid that, they're making it a whole lot easier to pay off the criminals. Even if an insurance company doesn't want to pay criminals, and they will pay to restore from backup and all of those things, there's nothing you can do about the records. The records are out there. The class action suit is coming, and if the insurance company's on the hook for that, everybody's suffering.
Yeah,
that's a whole. That's a whole industry, but people may not realize there's hundreds of class action attorneys that wait for these notifications. The key is you build your class as fast as you can. And if your class gets built big enough, all the other cases get subsumed under your firm, and you get all the legal fees. So you got 100 firms trying to build class action suits. They're all going to get built. Somebody wins, but us as consumers probably lose.
And, I think I'm sure the news just came out this week, HCA and their breach, they now have 4 class action lawsuits. And, that came out.
Common Spirits got class action.
Yeah. And so I actually saw on LinkedIn, somebody posted that news about, 4 class action lawsuits against HCA, and another law firm commented and said, ours is coming too. Earlier you had talked about the cost of a breach. So a year ago, there was a study that said the cost of a breach, a cost of a healthcare ransomware attack was at $8 million. It's now up to 11. And I want to talk about this slide in 2 parts, because don't you all go do math and try to add up the numbers on the right to 11 million. That's not what this slide is saying. Part 1. The average cost of a healthcare ransomware attack is $11 million. What we're looking at on the bottom right here is a hospital that I know well. I know the CIO well, and that fella gave me some of the costs from their attack. And here is what they saw. They saw downtime cost $2 million. Equipment replacement was $500,000. Legal costs were $2 million. That was before any class actions, by the way. Missed billing costs was $500,000, and that was 6 months in, so that might change. Remediation, they spent $2.5 million. Overtime and staff, 1.5, and then other bucket of stuff, and they did not pay the ransom, but that didn't include a ransom payment. And by the way, for them, insurance covered 40%. John Delano, when you see these costs, are these surprising? Do these seem low? What do they? How did these strike you?
Obviously the costs are going to be I think relative to the size of the system, but these would seem in line. Certainly based on how long you were down, how long you were impacted. The other thing I don't see represented here, and a lot of places can measure it, is what's the cost to your brand, right, for having an incident. And so I think this is great. Just a great representation of cost. It doesn't matter what the actual number is. Just showing the different areas that are impacted, and that these aren't small numbers. They're relatively large numbers, and I would say that this would tend to be on the low side, in my opinion.
Yeah. And Douglas asks a question, Mike, in the chat. Are you seeing a shift in the criminals respecting payments and actually destroying the records they collected if you pay?
We will never know. That is a really good question. And how could that ever be verified? And so, to my knowledge, we have never seen an instance where a gang promised that they would destroy the information and then have it show up later for sale online. But I suspect that, especially because some of the records for younger patients are going to be more durable, I suspect they may try to monetize that a year or more down the road. So that is the $64,000 question, or the $64 million question, as we're assembling costs here. And I think it's going to happen, but to my knowledge, it's not happened.
Douglas, and I sat in a room and listened to two very high-powered individuals argue that point, where one said, well, if you can point out that the criminals are not worth trusting, then nobody will trust them. So there's honor among thieves. And then somebody else said, are you kidding me? Why would there possibly be honor among thieves? You can't trust the terrorists. I think you know which one I think.
Yeah, somebody knocked down a hospital.
And
Let's
Jake,
trust
wasn't
them.
that your
Yeah.
wasn't that your third bullet point on predictions earlier in the slides?
Is don't trust the terrorists. Yes, I did write that bullet point. So so you know where I am. So the report. So we have a couple more things to bring here. One thing, so we'll send the report to everybody. We have found that the report needs context, and here's why. The top of the report says the number of breaches are down. And so what we've seen, unfortunately, happen is, you send that to an executive team or a board, and they say, oh, we don't need to spend as much on cybersecurity. That is, of course, not what the report is saying. So Mike and I have done, after the last report, we did this for a bunch of folks. We're happy to sit down with your team and go through the report and how it would impact your organization, depending on the size of your organization, and what your takeaways should be. If you want to email my colleague, Ellie at criticalinsight.com, she can do the calendar ping pong there if that's something that is of interest to you. The other thing is, earlier we talked about NIST CSF. Mike, you have created a spreadsheet based with NIST CSF that you're going through with folks as HHS tells people to focus on NIST CSF.
Yes. So first of all, to be clear, this is a cooperative piece of work I did with a CISO of another organization in San Antonio, Texas. But what we did was we modified, anybody can get a spreadsheet with a NIST CSF on it. But in order to make it actionable for risk, okay, there's a difference between aligning your organization with a standard of practice based on this framework and using this framework to assess risk. Those are different things. And so we have to add fields for what's the likelihood, because this control outcome is not being met, what's the likelihood that there is a bad outcome here? For example, records disclosure, theft, extortion, service disruption, being used to attack others. Right? It's essentially 5 things. So because of the absence of a control, what's the likelihood that that could happen, and what would its impact be? And then you're talking risk. So it creates these figures in a couple of ways. One is a spider diagram here where you can set what you think your maturity level should be for your organization. And then as time goes on, there's a way to track, did we get closer to our maturity target or did we slide back? There are also other pie charts and other things that detail exactly where there are control weaknesses and where you should prioritize your efforts to implement controls in terms of a corrective action plan. So you can run this all the way out and use the sheet and say, okay, we've conducted a risk assessment based on the NIST cybersecurity framework, just like HHS is telling us to do. They're saying, the guidance that is coming out, if you read through that, yes, you need to do your HIPAA risk assessment every year, and we want you to use this tool to do it. Not necessarily the tool that we created and give away, but they want you to use the NIST cybersecurity framework. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And again, if you run this out and you identify a risk, you assign a disposition to it. We're going to accept, avoid, mitigate through controls, or transfer through insurance. You can take that through a governance organization and have your governance agree that's what we'll do, or not, that you want to mitigate with controls, and they'll say, we'll accept that risk. But that's the right way to do it. The right fingerprints are on that. So here are the pie charts that tell you where risk is concentrated in the focus areas of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Remember that version 2.0 is coming out, and it's going to include the governance piece as well as identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. This is 1.1 version right here. And again, it tells you where you may have slid back from last year. So use of this tool, and we got a little instructional primer that goes with it. Use of this tool aligns you with what HHS is telling you to do. It brings you into this governance organization, this governance focus area, because identify risk. You got to do something with the risks you've identified. And if you don't get fingerprints from executives and potentially the C-suite, because they need to be informed as well, you're not doing it the way they're telling you to do it. Security is not about buying products anymore. It's about managing the program. So this is a useful tool for this. And I think there's one more slide in here, Jake, that actually shows what the business end of the tool looks like. Yeah. Okay. So we're happy to give you this. We're happy to give you this with set of instructions. It is actually good if somebody leads you through this the first time you use it. You notice that there is also a crosswalk column there to tell you how that particular outcome, because this is an outcome-based framework. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't say put this control in place. It says make this thing happen. How you do it is up to you. And then it crosswalks that against PCI, against HIPAA, against other things, so that you know in terms of unified compliance, how those things can be applied. So a lot of these are just pull downs. If you have a high probability and a high impact, well, you multiply those together, and obviously that's high. And there's a little nuance in here where you may say, well, that's maybe medium. If it's a medium likelihood and a high impact, you may want to call that medium. You may want to call that high, right? So there's a little interpretation there based on your knowledge of your own organization. But again, we will absolutely give this to anybody that wants it. It takes probably a week, your first time that you go through it. And if you run it all the way out, we've identified a risk. We say we're going to mitigate it with controls. Are we going to make a capital purchase? Are we going to hire consultants? Are we going to deliver this with internal resources only? If so, how many hours does that take? And it gives you a budget estimate for that corrective action. And that can form the basis of your budget asks during budget season, can also inform your grant asks for not only the state local cybersecurity grant program that is active right now, where if your hospital has an elected board, you may be in scope, but also other grant programs that are coming out specifically focused on the healthcare sector. So
Thanks, Mike.
if you want this, we'll give it to you.
And the other thing I want to say here as we begin to wrap up is, as you look at the breaches in healthcare, obviously the bad guys are not letting up. We can help with that. We help organizations prepare for an attack, detect, and respond. I think the best way to think about what we do, though, is to work with Mike on that spreadsheet and develop a roadmap. And so, I'm gonna get some final thoughts from folks here, but one of the, my colleague Ginny is going to put 2 links in the chat. Number one is a Calendly link, and if you want to set time with Mike, you can use that Calendly link to go through that spreadsheet, and Mike will send it to you. The other thing is at the end of all of our webinars, we get feedback from you. And there's a survey, and everyone who takes the survey, one, we donate to an InfoSec charity for everybody who gives it to us. And second, like we love your feedback. And in there has some questions about your InfoSec plans that help us figure out some things about our webinars and some things about our products. So we do appreciate that. And earlier I gave an email address for Ellie who can ping pong and set anything up. So 3 things. Number one is if you want us to sit down and talk to you or your board with the healthcare breach report and say, okay, this is how it impacts you. Not in a sales way, just in a, hey, here's the breach report. Here's what it means for your organization. Mike and I can do that. You can organize that with Ellie. Second, if you want Mike's spreadsheet, you can let him know. And third, obviously, is if you want to talk to us about any of the services I showed before, happy to help with that. So let's go back to the report here and get some final thoughts. We're going to go John and then Fred and then Mike. John, final thoughts. How should people leave today thinking about the breach report?
Yeah, I would say from what I see, we have to stay diligent and to what we just discussed, create an action plan. Even if it's a multi-year plan, you need to have an action plan. Take that to the board, get the support of the board so that you have the resources to action on that plan, and focus on the things there that you get the biggest bang for the buck. Right, the most critical would be my recommendation, and then if at all possible, dovetail on that by creating playbooks so you know what to do when things go wrong. It's become a matter of not if but when. So those would be my 2 biggest recommendations.
Awesome. Fred, final thoughts.
Yeah, third-party risk management. It's finally here for every one of us at this point. So if you do not have a good handle of the security of your vendors and that your requirements are reflected in your business associate agreements, go back and take care of it, because that's just a ticking time bomb waiting to go off.
Mr. Hamilton, final thoughts.
Final thoughts are, there are 3 things from this report that pop out to me. Number one is what Fred said, but I'm going to supply a little color to that. If you have a third-party arrangement with a provider of records, and maybe that's the parent company of your own hospital or clinic, you need to assess them. You need to know what their status is in terms of security. Number 2, you need to start doing real risk governance, right? The HICP and the guidance coming out from HHS say they want you to do governance. They also say that if you are aligning with the practices they have in there, there's a little bit of a safe harbor from being fined when there is an event. So that's a good thing to take home too. And then thirdly, if there is a vulnerability announced and you have an internet facing version of that vulnerability, treat it as an incident because it has become a race. Those 3 things pop right out of this report to me.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have additional questions, shoot them over to Ellie. If you want that the spreadsheet or the report, email her. She'll get it over to you. She is the nexus for all things. On behalf of Mike and Brett and Fred and John, thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your summer. Have a good day.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Stay away from smoke, fires, hurricanes, all that stuff.